So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for the moment. And we all have a piece of bread in front of us. And I'm going to invite us to each just hold that piece of bread in our hands, but with our eyes closed, so we can keep our focus. And I'm going to invite you to just take a few moments and just notice the texture of the bread. Notice the feel of it. Maybe bring it to your nose and notice how it smells. And as I share this meditation, I invite you to just take pieces of it and eat it slowly and mindfully, just tasting and savoring this bread in your hands. There are some cultures who don't use knives to cut bread because bread is too sacred to take a knife to. Bread is part of sacred meals for many traditions and for many peoples. And it became part of sacred meals because it was this food that took an entire community to make a loaf of bread. The grain had to be sown and grown and harvested. The wheat had to be separated from the chaff, and the wheat had to be ground. Water had to be added to the wheat, and someone had to get that water from a river or a well that maybe somebody had to dig, and they had to get the water in a bucket that somebody had to make from a tree that grew and died over centuries. And then as the yeast was drawn into the bread, literally out of thin air, the dough rose, and then someone had to knead it so it could rise again and rise again and rise again. And finally, someone had to make the sacred fire in an oven that somebody else had made of earth. And the final magic was made, and out came a sacred loaf of bread. Now, our process for making bread is a little less communal, but it's not so different when we're eating mindfully. It's just that we don't have any idea who made this bread, but somebody did. And the grain came from somewhere, some specific land, with very specific workers. The land itself has a story, a history, people who were displaced in order to make room for the fields that would grow the grain that make this bread. In many ways, the sacred connections are lost to us in the baking of bread, but when we eat bread, this bread today, in a sacred way, we're beginning to restore those sacred connections. From the gospel lesson for this Sunday, you will hear, "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened." And from the following Sunday's gospel, you will read, "Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves. and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And in between these 2 Sundays of texts we've just heard is the ancient earth festival of Lammas, or Loaf Mass. It's the first grain harvest festival of the year, and it's celebrated by making a loaf of bread as a sacred offering in gratitude for the harvest. And so today, in a small way, by eating this bread mindfully and with gratitude, we are restoring our sacred connections to bread, to food, to community, to earth, to God. And the people said, Amen.